In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, thousands of young Americans stood at the threshold of history. Some knelt in prayer on heaving transport ships. Others vomited from fear and seasickness. Many wrote final letters they hoped would never be read. They were about to attempt something never before achieved in warfare, storming Hitler's fortress Europe from the sea. This is part one of our complete three-part documentary series on D-Day and the Battle of Normandy, America's defining moment in World War II. Over the next hour, across 3 20-minute episodes, you'll discover the authentic, verified story of how American forces broke Hitler's Atlantic Wall, liberated France, and changed the course of human history. In this first episode, The Longest Day Begins. We'll witness the operation's critical first 12 hours, from paratroopers dropping into the Norman countryside at midnight to infantry fighting for survival on Omaha Beach at dawn. You'll learn why American commanders called this the war's most desperate gamble, and how ordinary men achieved the extraordinary. Part 2, Breaking Hitler's Atlantic Wall. We'll follow American forces as they fought inland, battling through the deadly bocage countryside to secure the beachhead. Part 3, Victory in Normandy, reveals how American persistence and sacrifice ultimately broke the German army and opened the road to Paris. Everything you're about to hear comes from authenticated sources. The National WW2 Museum in New Orleans, the National Archives and Records Administration, the U.S. Army Center of Military History, and the first-hand testimonies of American veterans preserved in the Library of Congress. This is their story. This is America's story. It begins in darkness, with men falling from the sky. By the spring of 1944, Nazi Germany had controlled Western Europe for 4 years. Adolf Hitler's regime had murdered millions, enslaved nations, and threatened to extinguish democracy forever. Britain stood defiant but exhausted. The Soviet Union fought desperately in the East, losing soldiers by the hundreds of thousands. America, brought into the war by Pearl Harbor's treachery, had become democracy's last, best hope. The strategic situation demanded action. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had promised Soviet leader Joseph Stalin a second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on Russian forces. But more than politics drove the decision. Military planners understood a fundamental truth. Nazi Germany would never be defeated without American boots on European soil. The challenge was staggering. Hitler had fortified Europe's Atlantic coast with the most formidable defensive system ever constructed, the Atlantic Wall. Stretching from Norway to Spain, it bristled with concrete bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests, tank obstacles, and millions of mines. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Germany's most celebrated commander, had spent months strengthening these defenses, particularly in France's Pas-de-Calais region, where the English Channel was narrowest. But American and British planners had chosen a different target, Normandy. The beaches of northern France, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, would become the stage for history's largest amphibious invasion. The operation was designated Overlord, its naval component, Neptune, the date determined by moon phases and tides. Early June 1944. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Kansan who'd never seen combat before World War II, bore ultimate responsibility. Under him, American commanders like General Omar Bradley would lead forces against beaches Omaha and Utah. The price of failure was unthinkable, not just military defeat, but the potential collapse of the alliance and indefinite continuation of Nazi tyranny. June 5, 1944. Late afternoon. At dozens of airfields across southern England, American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions prepared for the mission that would determine whether D-Day succeeded or failed. These elite soldiers, average age just 22, would jump hours before the beach landings, securing vital roads, bridges, and causeways behind enemy lines. Each man carried over 80 pounds of equipment: main parachute, reserve chute rifle or carbine, ammunition, grenades, rations, first aid kit, gas mask, entrenching tool. Some carried even more: machine guns, mortar rounds, explosives. They'd painted their faces with cocoa and linseed oil to darken them for night operations. Many had shaved their heads into mohawks, a gesture of defiance and unit pride. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Wolverton of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne, gathered his men. A devout officer from Arkansas, he composed a prayer that thousands would hear that evening. "I would not give anything for the opportunity to serve with you men and to take a crack at the Hun. May God be with each of you fine soldiers." Wolverton would be dead within hours. As darkness fell, the paratroopers boarded their C-47 transport aircraft. Over 800 planes would carry the 82nd and 101st into Normandy. The flight across the English Channel took 90 minutes. Men sang, joked nervously, or sat in silence with private thoughts. Some were so heavily loaded they needed help boarding the aircraft. Shortly after midnight on June 6, the transports crossed the Normandy coast. Anti-aircraft fire erupted. Streams of tracers, explosive flak burst, turning night into deadly daylight. Pilots took evasive action, breaking formation. Aircraft were hit, caught fire, exploded. Paratroopers stood hooked to static lines, waiting for the green light that would send them into darkness. When it came, they jumped. The airborne assault was a disaster. Scattered by anti-aircraft fire and pilot error, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions landed across hundreds of square miles of Norman countryside. Instead of concentrated combat units, small groups of lost paratroopers wandered in darkness, searching for landmarks, friendly forces, or their objectives. Many landed in flooded fields the Germans had deliberately inundated, weighed down by equipment. Dozens drowned in water just 4 feet deep. Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment became one of D-Day's most famous figures when his parachute snagged on the church steeple in St. Mary-Église. He hung there for 2 hours, playing dead, as German soldiers shot other paratroopers descending into the town square. He survived, was captured, then later escaped. But the chaos had an unexpected benefit. The scattered drop confused German defenders, who reported paratroopers everywhere. German commanders couldn't determine where the main thrust would come. Small groups of Americans, trained to operate independently, began accomplishing their missions despite being scattered. They used cricket clackers, small metal toys that made a clicking sound, to identify each other in darkness. 1 click, answered by 2 clicks, meant friend. No answer meant enemy. Lieutenant Richard Winters, commanding Easy Company of the 506th Regiment, found himself with just 2 men near St. Marie-du-Mont. Throughout the night, he gathered lost paratroopers until he had a functioning unit. At dawn, with 15 men, Winters would assault a German artillery battery at Precourt Manor for 105mm guns that could devastate Utah Beach. His small force destroyed the position, killing or capturing 50 Germans while losing 4 men. The action would earn Winters a Distinguished Service Cross and later inspire the book and miniseries Band of Brothers. Across the drop zones, similar small unit actions occurred. Paratroopers seized bridges, cut telephone lines, ambushed German patrols, and created havoc far beyond their actual numbers. By dawn, though scattered and understrength, they'd accomplished their primary mission, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the beaches where, at that moment, the greatest armada in history was approaching shore. As paratroopers fought in darkness inland, the largest naval force ever assembled crossed the English Channel toward Normandy's beaches. 5,000 ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, landing craft, minesweepers carried 160,000 Allied troops toward Hitler's fortress Europe. The American component included over 73,000 soldiers destined for Utah and Omaha beaches. Most had been at sea since the evening of June 5th, when Eisenhower made his final decision to launch despite threatening weather. The crossing was miserable. Rough seas made thousands seasick. Men vomited continuously. Some were so weak from seasickness they could barely stand when the order came to load into landing craft. Veterans of previous amphibious operations, Sicily, Salerno, Italy, tried to calm the new soldiers. But everyone knew this was different. This was the main event. At 0200 hours, 12 miles offshore, the massive battleships and cruisers opened fire. The naval bombardment was designed to pulverize German defenses before troops landed. 14-inch and 16-inch guns from battleships like USS Texas and USS Arkansas hurled shells weighing up to a ton toward the coast. The sound was apocalyptic, continuous thunder that could be heard in England 50 miles away. But the bombardment would prove less effective than hoped. Many shells fell inland, missing beach fortifications. Darkness and cloud cover prevented accurate fire. German bunkers, constructed with concrete walls 6 feet thick, withstood near-direct hits. Unknown to Allied intelligence, Rommel had significantly strengthened Omaha Beach's defenses in recent months, installing more guns, more bunkers, and more obstacles than expected. At 0330 hours, soldiers began loading into landing craft, rectangular steel boats called LCVPs, designed by New Orleans boat builder Andrew Higgins. The Higgins boat could carry 36 men through shallow water, then drop a front ramp for rapid exit. Eisenhower would later say Higgins was the man who won the war for us, because without his landing craft, the invasion would have been impossible. The transfer from transport ships to landing craft in rough seas was dangerous. Men climbed down cargo nets with full equipment, while both ship and boat rose and fell in 12-foot swells. Some fell between ship and craft, crushed or drowned. Others dropped into boats already swamped with seawater. As the landing craft circled, waiting for H hour, the scheduled landing time, dawn broke over Normandy. Soldiers could now see the coast, a line of cliffs, smoke from the naval bombardment, and the obstacles Rommel had placed in the surf: steel posts, wooden stakes, concrete tetrahedrons, all designed to rip open landing craft or impale them. The first wave headed for shore. Utah Beach to the west, Omaha Beach to the east. For Utah, the landing would be relatively successful. For Omaha, it would be slaughter. At 0630 hours, the 4th Infantry Division hit Utah Beach. Due to strong currents and navigation error, the entire assault force landed nearly 2,000 yards south of the intended target. This accident proved fortuitous. The actual landing area was more lightly defended than the planned sector, but the American soldiers waiting ashore didn't know that yet. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of President Theodore Roosevelt and at 56, the oldest man in the first assault wave, had insisted on landing with the lead elements despite his age and poor health. When his battalion commander reported they had landed in the wrong location, Roosevelt made an instant decision. We'll start the war from right here. That decision saved lives. Rather than attempting to shift the landing to the intended beach, Roosevelt organized troops to advance inland from where they stood. Engineers blew gaps through seawalls. Infantry moved west and north. Casualties were relatively light. About 200 on Utah Beach that day, far fewer than 1,000 predicted. Inland, the 101st Airborne had seized causeways across flooded areas, allowing the 4th Infantry to advance. By afternoon, Utah Beach had been secured, and 12 miles of coastline were in American hands. 23,000 troops would come ashore at Utah on D-Day, linking with airborne forces to create a continuous beachhead. Roosevelt, who'd suffered a heart attack months earlier and would die of another just 5 weeks after D-Day, became the only general officer to land in the first assault wave. He'd earned the Medal of Honor posthumously, joining his father as one of only two father-son pairs to receive America's highest military decoration. Utah Beach was a success, but 10 miles east at Omaha Beach, a very different story was unfolding. Omaha Beach was a killing ground, unlike Utah, where troops landed in the wrong place but found weak defenses. Omaha's attackers hit exactly where planned and discovered the strongest German position on the entire Normandy coast. The 352nd Infantry Division, a full-strength combat unit that Allied intelligence had failed to detect, occupied the bluffs above the beach. The German soldiers were veterans, well-trained, and they'd been waiting. The beach itself was a death trap, 5,000 yards long. It curved in a crescent between rocky headlands. A low, sandy shore led to a pebble bank, then a seawall, and finally steep bluffs rising 170 feet. German defenders had fortified these bluffs with concrete bunkers housing artillery pieces, mortars, and machine guns, all with interlocking fields of fire that covered every yard of beach. Rommel's obstacles: over 4 million mines, steel stakes, concrete barriers, littered the surf zone. At 0630 hours, the first wave landed. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, composed of men from Bedford, Virginia, a town of just 3,500 people, hit Dog Green sector of Omaha Beach. Within minutes, the company was destroyed. German machine guns firing 800 rounds per minute cut down men as the landing craft ramps dropped. Those who made it off the boats waded through chest-deep water under continuous fire. Bodies floated in the surf. The water turned red. 19 Bedford men died in the first 15 minutes, the highest per capita loss of any American community on D-Day. By day's end, Bedford would lose 23 soldiers, and the town would later be chosen as the site of the National D-Day Memorial. Across Omaha Beach, the scene repeated. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, veterans of North Africa and Sicily, and the 29th Infantry Division, National Guard soldiers from Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, suffered appalling casualties. Landing craft struck mines and exploded. Artillery shells fell among the assault waves. Men carrying 70 pounds of equipment drowned in 6 feet of water. The wounded drowned when tide came in. The dead piled up at the waterline. Communications broke down. Landing craft delivered troops to wrong sectors. Tanks that were supposed to provide fire support sank when launched too far offshore. 27 of 32 duplex drive amphibious Sherman tanks went to bottom, drowning their crews. Artillery pieces, trucks, ammunition, all lost in the surf. By 800 hours, Omaha Beach looked like a complete failure. On Omaha Beach, 2,000 American soldiers were dead, dying, or wounded. Thousands more huddled against the seawall, pinned down by machine gun fire, unable to advance. The invasion teetered on the edge of catastrophe. Aboard the command ship USS Augusta, General Omar Bradley received reports of the disaster and considered evacuating Omaha Beach entirely, redirecting all forces to Utah. But on that blood-soaked sand, individual acts of courage began changing the outcome. Brigadier General Norman Cota, assistant commander of the 29th Division, landed at 0730 hours under heavy fire. At age 51, moving along the beach under constant fire, Cota rallied soldiers. "Gentlemen, we are being killed here on the beaches. Let's go inland and be killed." It was precisely the leadership desperate men needed: acknowledgement of their situation and a call to action. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment delivered a similar message. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach: those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Small groups of soldiers, led by sergeants and lieutenants, began moving. They used Bangalore torpedoes, explosive charges on poles, to blow gaps through barbed wire. They crossed the seawall. They advanced up the bluffs, despite mines, despite machine gun fire, despite casualties. There was no grand plan, no coordinated assault, just small units, led by junior officers and NCOs, finding ways forward. Destroyers offshore, seeing the disaster on the beach, did something unprecedented. They moved to within 1,000 yards ashore, risking running aground, and fired directly at German positions on the bluffs. These tin cans, thin-skinned destroyers designed for submarine warfare, engaged concrete bunkers with their 5-inch guns at point-blank range. The naval gunfire suppressed some German positions, allowing infantry to advance. Engineers, suffering 50% casualties, continued clearing obstacles under fire so subsequent waves could land. Medics treated the wounded with no cover, ignoring their own safety. Rangers assigned Assault Point Du Hoc between Omaha and Utah beaches, scaled 100-foot cliffs using rope ladders while Germans threw grenades down on them. By noon, Americans had penetrated the bluff defenses in several places. By 1300 hours, small groups were advancing inland. The German defenders, taking casualties from naval gunfire and increasingly flanked by infiltrating infantry, began withdrawing from forward positions. The crisis had passed. Omaha Beach remained hellish, but it was no longer a defeat. It had become a very costly victory. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, American forces had established a fragile foothold in Nazi-occupied France. At Utah Beach, 23,000 troops were ashore with relatively light casualties. At Omaha Beach, 34,000 men had landed, but at a terrible price. Over 2,000 American casualties, including nearly 500 dead. The beachhead at Omaha was barely a mile deep. Instead of the intended 10-mile advance, American forces clung to positions just beyond the bluffs. German counterattacks were expected hourly, but the men who'd survived that longest day dug in, prepared defenses, and waited for dawn. Across all 5 beaches, American, British, and Canadian, 156,000 Allied troops had landed, 10,000 casualties. For 1,000 confirmed dead, including over 2,000 Americans, these numbers were actually lower than the planners' worst-case scenarios, which had predicted catastrophic losses. But to the men who fought there, to the families who had received telegrams, the cost was incalculable. Medics worked through the night, treating wounded by flashlight. Graves registration teams began the grim task of collect. In homes across America, families gathered around radios on the evening of June 6th, listening to Edward R. Murrow and other correspondents report from London on the invasion's progress. President Roosevelt led the nation in prayer, asking divine protection for our sons, pride of our nation. Mothers and fathers, wives and sweethearts looked at photographs of young men in uniform, wondering if they were alive or dead, safe or suffering. Those young men, most still teenagers or in their early 20s, had achieved something extraordinary. With courage born of desperation and training, with sacrifice measured in blood and lives, they had breached the Atlantic Wall. They had given humanity a chance at victory over tyranny. Private John Barnes of the 116th Infantry, who survived Omaha Beach, later wrote, "We weren't heroes. We were just ordinary guys who did what we had to do. The heroes are the ones who didn't come back. But they were heroes, every single one. The men who jumped from aircraft into darkness. The men who waded through surf into machine gun fire. The men who climbed cliffs and blew up obstacles and crawled through minefields and did the impossible because failure meant the end of freedom. D-Day was not the end of World War II. It was barely the beginning of the end. The Battle of Normandy would rage for another 70 days. American forces would fight through Bocage, the hedgerow country of Normandy, losing thousands more men in brutal close quarters combat against determined German defenders. This is where our story continues. In part 2 of this 3-part series, Breaking Hitler's Atlantic Wall, you'll discover what happened next, how American forces pushed inland from the beaches into the deadly Norman countryside, how they fought the Battle of St. Lo, where the 29th Division earned the nickname Hell on Wheels, how American ingenuity and firepower slowly, painfully broke the German defensive lines. Part 3, Victory in Normandy, America's Triumph, will reveal the campaign's climactic battles. The breakout at St. Lo, the destruction of German armies in the Falaise Pocket, and the liberation of Paris. You'll learn how the Normandy campaign changed warfare forever and set the stage for Germany's defeat. Make sure you watch Part 2 to continue this incredible journey through America's finest hour. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next episode. Share this video with anyone who values freedom and wants to understand the sacrifice that preserved it. The men who fought on D-Day are disappearing. In 2026, fewer than 1% of World War II veterans remain alive. Their story must be remembered. Their sacrifice must never be forgotten. From the beaches of Normandy to the gates of Berlin, from the Pacific Islands to the home front, the greatest generation saved the world. This is their story. This is America's story. Watch Part 2 to discover how American forces broke through Hitler's offenses and turned D-Day's desperate foothold into victory.